The Georgia summer heat hit me like a slap the moment I stepped out of my beat-up Honda Civic. The familiar scent of magnolia blossoms mixed with the distant smell of barbecue smoke from somewhere in the neighborhood. I stood there for a moment, staring at the imposing Victorian house that had been in our family for 4 generations. The white columns still gleamed in the afternoon sun, the wraparound porch still invited visitors with its swing gently swaying in the humid breeze. But I wasn't exactly an invited visitor anymore. My phone buzzed with another text from my landlord back in Chicago. 3rd eviction notice this month. I shoved it back into my pocket without reading it fully. I already knew what it said. 3 months behind on rent again. The freelance graphic design work had dried up completely after my last client decided my creative vision wasn't worth the headache of my missed deadlines and erratic communication. Well. Look what the cat dragged in. I turned to see my sister Victoria stepping out of her pristine white BMW. Even in the stifling heat, she looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her sundress probably cost more than I made in 2 months, and her smile had that practiced southern charm that never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. "Hey Vicky." I managed a weak smile. "You look great." "I always do." She locked her car with a chirp and walked past me toward the house. "I'm surprised you actually showed up. Grandmother specifically asked for family only." The words stung more than they should have. "I'm family too. Are you?" She paused at the bottom of the porch steps, her manicured fingers gripping the white railing. "Because from what I've heard, you've been too busy living in that shoebox apartment, drowning in debt, to remember you even have a family." I felt my cheeks burn. News traveled fast in small southern towns, and apparently my failures had made their way back to Savannah despite my best efforts to keep them quiet. "I've been working." "Working?" Victoria laughed, the sound sharp and cutting. "Honey, sitting in coffee shops pretending to be an artist while you mooch off unemployment isn't working. It's pathetic." Before I could respond, the front door opened and our cousin Ben emerged, followed by his wife Lisa and their twin boys. Ben looked uncomfortable seeing us on the porch, clearly having overheard at least part of our conversation. "Hey there, stranger." Ben's voice was warm but cautious. He'd always been the peacekeeper in the family. "Good to see you made it down. Wouldn't miss it." I lied smoothly. Truth was, I'd almost skipped grandmother's 85th birthday celebration entirely. The bus ticket from Chicago had cleaned out what little was left in my checking account. Lisa gave me a polite hug, the kind that maintained proper distance. "How's the big city treating you?" "Can't complain." Another lie. "I seem to be full of them today." "That's not what I heard." Victoria's voice dripped with false concern. "Didn't you get evicted last month? Or was it the month before?" I lose track. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the cicadas seemed to quiet down. Ben cleared his throat awkwardly while Lisa suddenly found something fascinating about her shoes. "Victoria, that's enough." The voice came from the doorway, soft but commanding. Grandmother Eleanor stood there, all 5 feet 2 inches of her, but somehow she seemed to fill the entire space. At 85, she still carried herself with the dignity of someone who'd built a business empire from nothing and raised 5 children mostly on her own after grandfather passed. "Grandmother." Victoria's entire demeanor shifted, her voice becoming sickeningly sweet. "You look absolutely radiant." Eleanor's gray eyes, still sharp as ever, moved from Victoria to me. "Come inside, all of you. The others are already here and we have things to discuss." The interior of the house was exactly as I remembered it. The hardwood floors gleamed under the crystal chandelier, and the walls were lined with family portraits dating back to the 1800s. The air smelled like lemon polish and the faint aroma of Eleanor's famous peach cobbler wafting from the kitchen. My Uncle Robert stood near the massive stone fireplace, drink in hand, deep in conversation with my Aunt Patricia. They both looked up as we entered, their expressions carefully neutral. Robert had always been the ambitious one, the one who'd tried and failed to expand the family's cotton mill business into other ventures. Patricia, his younger sister, had married well and spent most of her time organizing charity events and making sure everyone knew about it. "There he is." Patricia's voice was too bright, too forced. "Our little artist. How are things in Chicago, sweetie?" "They're fine, Aunt Patricia." I accepted her air kiss on the cheek, the scent of her expensive perfume overwhelming. "I heard you had some trouble with your apartment?" Robert's question was direct, no pretense. He'd always been blunt to a fault. Victoria snorted from across the room. "Trouble is putting it mildly. He got kicked out for not paying rent." "I did not get kicked out." My voice came out louder than I intended. I'm just between places right now. Between places. Victoria shook her head, laughing. You're 28 years old, living like a college dropout, and you can't even afford basic rent. Do you know how embarrassing it is to have people ask me about my brother's latest failure? Victoria Elizabeth. Eleanor's voice cut through the room like a blade. That's quite enough. But Victoria was on a roll now, her perfect composure finally cracking to reveal the resentment underneath. No, grandmother, it's not enough. We're all here celebrating family and he shows up like some kind of charity case. Look at him. His shirt has holes in it, his car is falling apart, and he probably doesn't have $50 to his name. She wasn't wrong about any of it, which made it worse. My shirt did have small holes near the collar, my car was making concerning noises, and I'd counted exactly $37 in my wallet on the drive down. He's our family. Eleanor's voice was steady, but there was steel underneath. Is he though? Victoria's voice rose. When was the last time he called? When was the last time he visited? When was the last time he contributed anything to this family besides disappointment and embarrassment? The room fell completely silent. I could hear the old grandfather clock ticking in the corner, marking each second of my humiliation. My face burned with shame because I knew she was right. I had been avoiding family calls, making excuses to skip holidays, pretending I was too busy with my career to visit. You want to know what's pathetic? Victoria continued, her voice building to a crescendo. It's showing up here after months of silence, expecting us to welcome you with open arms while you live like a complete failure. You're pathetic. The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt every eye in the room on me, felt the weight of their pity and disappointment. My hands shook slightly as I shoved them into my pockets, trying to maintain some shred of dignity. That's when Eleanor moved. She walked slowly to the antique secretary desk that had belonged to her mother, her movements deliberate and purposeful. The entire room watched as she opened the top drawer and pulled out a manila envelope, thick with papers. Since we're talking about family contributions, Eleanor said quietly, turning back to face us all, I think it's time you all knew something. She held the envelope for a moment, her eyes moving from person to person around the room. When her gaze landed on me, I saw something there I couldn't quite identify. Sadness? Pride? Determination? Your grandfather and I worked very hard to build what this family has today. The mill, this house, the properties in town, the investments. She paused, letting her words settle. We always hoped that our children and their children would understand the value of not just wealth, but character. Victoria shifted uncomfortably. Grandmother, what does this have to do with? Everything, child. Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. You see, your grandfather left very specific instructions about the family estate. Instructions that I've honored for 23 years since his passing. She held up the envelope, and I could see my name written on the front in her careful script. The bulk of the family estate, including this house, the mill properties, and the majority of the investments, don't automatically go to the eldest or the most successful. Eleanor's eyes found mine across the room. They go to the family member who shows the most character in the face of adversity. The one who continues to try even when they fail. The one who maintains their integrity even when it costs them. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. Grandmother, what are you saying? Patricia's voice was barely a whisper. Eleanor walked toward me, her steps measured and deliberate. I'm saying that sometimes the person who appears to be the least successful is actually the one who's fighting the hardest battle with the most grace. She stopped in front of me and held out the envelope. Your grandfather and I have been watching. All of you. For years. With trembling hands I took the envelope. It was heavier than I expected. Go ahead, Eleanor said softly. Open it. My hands shook as I broke the wax seal on the envelope. The room was so quiet I could hear the paper rustling as I pulled out the documents inside. The first thing I saw was the letterhead of Morrison, Peterson and Associates, the law firm that had handled our family's legal matters for as long as I could remember. Last will and testament of Theodore James Montgomery. I read aloud, my voice barely above a whisper. Grandfather? Ben's voice cracked slightly. I looked up to see Eleanor nodding slowly. Read the highlighted section, sweetheart. My eyes scanned down the page until I found the yellow highlighted text. My mouth went dry as I read the words silently first, trying to process what I was seeing. This can't be right. I looked up at Eleanor, then back at the document. Read it out loud, she encouraged gently. I cleared my throat and began reading, my voice growing steadier with each word. To my grandson who bears the weight of trying without the reward of succeeding, who maintains kindness in the face of judgment, and who continues to pursue his dreams despite the mockery of others, I leave the main estate, including the family home at 1247 Magnolia Drive, the Montgomery Cotton Mill and all associated properties, and 75% of all investments and holdings. The silence that followed was broken by Victoria's sharp intake of breath. That's not possible. Patricia's voice was shaky. Mother, you said the will had never been read. I said the contents had never been discussed. Eleanor's correction was gentle but firm. Your father updated this will 3 times in his final years. The last revision was made just 2 months before he passed, after he'd had time to observe all of his grandchildren as they grew into adults. Robert stepped forward, his face pale. Mother, surely you can't mean to honor this. The boy can't even pay his rent. How is he supposed to maintain a property this size? The mill needs constant oversight. The investments require wisdom, not just business sense. Eleanor's interruption was swift. And wisdom often comes from understanding failure as much as success. I was still staring at the papers, trying to make sense of what I was reading. There were property deeds, stock certificates, bank account information. Numbers that seemed impossible. The cotton mill alone was valued at over $2 million, and that was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. This house is worth at least $1.2 million, Victoria said, her voice hollow. The mill, the downtown properties, the investment portfolio, we're talking about over $5 million total. $5.7 million to be more precise. Eleanor's voice was matter-of-fact. As of last month's valuation. I sank into the nearest chair, the papers scattered across my lap. $5.7 million. I'd been worried about $37 in my wallet and a 3-month eviction notice. But why? I finally managed to ask, looking up at Eleanor. Why me? Victoria's right, I am a failure. I can't hold down a job, I can't pay my bills, I can't even. Can't even what? Eleanor moved to sit in the chair across from me, her eyes never leaving mine. Can't even give up on your dreams? Can't even become bitter despite facing rejection after rejection? Can't even stop helping others even when you barely have enough for yourself? I frowned. I don't know what you mean. Don't you? Eleanor smiled softly. Tell me, what did you do with your last unemployment check? My face heated up. That's not, I mean. You gave half of it to your neighbor Mrs. Chen when her heat got shut off in the middle of winter. Eleanor's voice was warm now. And the month before that, you spent your grocery money on art supplies for the after-school program you volunteer at. The same program you've been helping with for 2 years, even though they can't afford to pay you. I stared at her in shock. How do you? Did you think I didn't know about the food bank where you volunteer every Saturday? Or the fact that you've been tutoring high school kids in design software for free? Or that you gave your last client a full refund when their business failed, even though you'd already completed the work? Victoria scoffed. Those aren't business decisions, grandmother. Those are just naive mistakes. No, Victoria. Eleanor's voice turned sharp as she looked at her granddaughter. Those are character decisions. Those are the actions of someone who understands that success isn't just about accumulating wealth, it's about how you treat people when no one is watching. She turned back to me, her expression softening again. Your grandfather was a lot like you when he was young. People called him a dreamer, said he'd never amount to anything. He failed at 3 different business ventures before the mill succeeded. But he never stopped trying, and more importantly, he never let those failures make him cruel or selfish. Patricia stepped forward, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Mother, I understand the sentiment, but realistically, he's not prepared for this kind of responsibility. Maybe we could work out some kind of trust arrangement, or... There is a trust arrangement. Eleanor held up another document. If he chooses to accept the inheritance, he'll work with the family lawyer and a financial advisor for the first 2 years. The mill has an excellent management team in place, and the investment portfolio is handled by professionals. This isn't about throwing him into the deep end without a life preserver. But why not divide it equally among all the grandchildren? Ben asked quietly. I mean, I'm not complaining, but it seems. Because your grandfather and I didn't believe in participation trophies. Eleanor's voice was firm. Robert, you tried to use family connections to start 3 businesses that failed because you cut corners and treated employees poorly. Patricia, you married for money and have spent the last 15 years looking down on anyone who has less than you do. Victoria, you've built your entire identity around status and appearances while showing contempt for anyone who doesn't meet your standards. The accusations hung heavy in the room. No one tried to deny them. And Ben? Eleanor's voice gentled as she looked at her youngest grandson. Ben, you're a good man, but you've never taken a risk in your life. You've played it safe at every turn, and while there's nothing wrong with that, It's not the spirit your grandfather wanted to reward. She stood and walked to the window overlooking the back garden where my grandfather's prized roses still bloomed every summer. He wanted the inheritance to go to the grandchild who understood that real wealth comes from how you treat people, not from how much you accumulate. To someone who would use the resources to make a difference, not just to make themselves more comfortable. I was still processing everything, the papers feeling heavier in my hands with each passing moment. But what if I mess it up? What if I prove everyone right and lose everything? Eleanor turned back to me, her smile warm and confident. Then you'll pick yourself up and try again. Just like you always have. Victoria had been unusually quiet, but now she stepped forward, her face pale and her voice shaky. This isn't fair. I've worked hard my entire life. I graduated summa cum laude, I built a successful marketing firm, I married well, I've never been a burden on anyone. And you're going to give everything to him because he volunteers at a food bank. I'm going to honor your grandfather's wishes because he recognized something the rest of you missed. Eleanor's voice was gentle but unwavering. Success without character is just accumulation. Wealth without compassion is just greed. Your brother may struggle with practical matters, but he has never struggled with his humanity. The weight of responsibility was settling on my shoulders like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about money. This was about a legacy that stretched back 4 generations. This was about a grandfather I'd barely known recognizing something in me that I'd never seen in myself. I need some air, I said quietly, setting the papers carefully on the coffee table. I walked out onto the back porch, the Georgia heat hitting me again like a physical presence. The garden stretched out before me, meticulously maintained despite Eleanor's age. Grandfather's roses were in full bloom, their fragrance mixing with the honeysuckle that climbed the far fence. I could hear muffled voices from inside the house, family members processing the bomb that had just been dropped on all of us. Part of me wanted to walk back inside and refuse the inheritance. It would be easier to stay the family failure than to become the family disappointment who lost everything. But another part of me, a part I'd been ignoring for too long, was already thinking about what I could do with resources like these. The after-school program that desperately needed funding. The community center that was about to close. The small businesses in my Chicago neighborhood that were struggling to survive. Maybe, just maybe, grandfather had seen something in me that was worth betting on. The sound of the screen door creaking open pulled me from my thoughts. I expected to see Eleanor, but instead, Victoria stepped onto the porch. Her perfect composure had cracked, and for the first time in years, she looked genuinely vulnerable. I owe you an apology. Her voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the cicadas. I turned to look at her, surprised by the admission. Victoria. No, let me say this. She leaned against the porch railing, her hands gripping the white wood so tightly her knuckles were pale. What I said in there, calling you pathetic, that was cruel. And it wasn't even really about you. The afternoon sun was starting to sink lower, casting long shadows across the garden. Victoria's perfectly styled appearance seemed less important now, her vulnerability making her look younger, more like the sister I remembered from childhood. Then what was it about? I asked gently. She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the roses. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. Do you know why I really married James? James was her husband of 3 years, a successful lawyer who came from old Savannah money. I'd met him a handful of times at family events, and he'd always seemed pleasant enough, if a bit cold. Because you loved him? I offered. Victoria laughed bitterly. Because his family had money and connections. Because marrying him meant I'd never have to worry about financial security. Because I was terrified of ending up like... She trailed off, but I could fill in the blank. Like me. Like Dad. The words came out in a rush. Do you remember what happened when I was in high school? When Dad's construction business went under? I did remember vaguely. I'd been in middle school at the time, more concerned with video games and friends than family finances. But I recalled the stress in the house, the hushed conversations between our parents, the way Dad would sit at the kitchen table late at night with papers spread everywhere. We almost lost our house, Victoria continued. Mom had to go back to work at the department store. Dad took a job doing manual labor for half what he used to make. I watched them struggle for 2 years, watched Dad's pride crumble bit by bit. She wiped at her eyes, careful not to smudge her makeup. I swore I would never let that happen to me. I would never be dependent on anyone else's success, and I would never marry someone who couldn't provide stability. But James does provide that, I pointed out. Yes, he does. Victoria's smile was sad. He provides a beautiful house, expensive cars, designer clothes, and absolutely no emotional connection whatsoever. We're like roommates who share a bank account. The revelation hit me harder than I expected. All these years, I'd envied Victoria's seemingly perfect life, her success, her confidence. I'd never considered what she might have sacrificed to achieve it. I've been so focused on financial security that I forgot about everything else. Victoria's voice broke slightly. I don't have children because James thinks they would be inconvenient. I don't have real friends because everyone in our social circle is just networking. I don't even know what I actually enjoy doing anymore because everything I do is calculated to maintain appearances. She turned to look at me directly, tears finally spilling over. And then you show up, broke and struggling and completely unconcerned about what anyone thinks, and I hate that I'm jealous of that freedom. I reached out and put my hand on her shoulder. Vicky, you don't have to live like that. Don't I? She shook her head. I'm 30 years old and I've built my entire identity around material success. If I walk away from James, I lose everything. The house, the lifestyle, the security. And I'm terrified that without all of that, there's nothing left of me that's worth anything. The screen door opened again, and this time it was Eleanor who joined us on the porch. She looked between Victoria and me, her expression understanding. I wondered when this conversation would happen, she said softly. Victoria straightened, trying to regain her composure. Grandmother, You think I didn't know about your marriage troubles? Eleanor's voice was gentle. Sweetheart, I've been watching this family for 85 years. I know when someone is unhappy. Then why didn't you say something? Because you weren't ready to hear it. Eleanor moved to sit in one of the wicker chairs that had been on this porch for as long as I could remember. Sometimes people need to come to their own realizations. Inside the house, I could hear the murmur of voices as the rest of the family continued to discuss the inheritance. Through the window, I caught glimpses of Robert pacing and Patricia gesticulating wildly. They think I'm going to contest the will, Victoria said, following my gaze. Are you? Eleanor asked. Victoria considered the question seriously. A week ago I would have. But now, she looked at me with something that might have been respect. Maybe grandfather saw something the rest of us missed. Eleanor smiled. Your grandfather was an excellent judge of character. He saw potential where others saw failure, strength where others saw weakness. But what if I really do mess this up? I asked, voicing the fear that had been growing since I'd read those documents. What if I prove that everyone was right about me? Then you'll learn from it and do better next time. Eleanor's answer was matter of fact. Failure isn't the opposite of success, it's part of success. Your grandfather failed more times than he succeeded, but each failure taught him something valuable. Victoria wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. What you said in there about the volunteer work and helping people, is that all true? I nodded, feeling heat rise in my cheeks again. It's not as noble as grandmother made it sound. Mrs. Chin is just a sweet old lady, and those kids at the after-school program remind me why I got into design in the first place. You gave away money you couldn't afford to give away, Victoria said quietly. I spend more on a single dinner out than you gave to help someone keep their heat on, and I complained about the restaurant being too crowded. The weight of the conversation was settling between us, years of misunderstanding and resentment finally being addressed. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun sink lower and listening to the sounds of evening approaching. There's something else, Eleanor said eventually. Something I haven't told the others yet. Victoria and I both looked at her expectantly. The inheritance comes with conditions, Eleanor continued. Not legal conditions but personal ones. Your grandfather's letter explains them in detail. She reached into her pocket and pulled out another envelope, this one smaller and sealed with red wax. My name was written on it in handwriting I didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. This is from him directly. Written the week before he passed away. I took the letter with trembling hands. The wax seal bore the impression of his signet ring, the one that had been passed down through 4 generations of Montgomery men. Should I read it now? I asked. That's up to you, Eleanor replied. But I think it might help you understand why he made the choice he did. I broke the seal carefully and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was shaky but still legible, and I could almost hear his voice in the words. My dear grandson, I began reading aloud. If you are reading this, then Eleanor has finally shared my decision with the family, and you're probably wondering why an old man would entrust his life's work to someone who struggles to trust his own worth. Victoria moved closer so she could read along. The answer is simple, because worth isn't measured by bank accounts or job titles or social status. Worth is measured by how you treat people when you have nothing to gain from it. Worth is measured by whether you maintain your integrity when it costs you something. Worth is measured by your willingness to keep trying even when everyone tells you you're going to fail. I had to pause, the words blurring as my eyes filled with tears. I've watched you volunteer at that food bank every Saturday for 2 years. I've seen you give away money you couldn't spare and time you didn't have. I've watched you pursue your dreams despite criticism from people who stopped dreaming decades ago. And I've seen you treat everyone with kindness, regardless of their station in life. Victoria's hand found my arm, squeezing gently. The money and property I'm leaving you aren't rewards for past behavior. They're tools for future service. Use them wisely, but more importantly, use them generously. Build something that matters. Help people who need help. Create beauty in a world that often seems determined to destroy it. I looked up at Eleanor, who was watching me with tears in her eyes. And remember, I continued reading, that the greatest success isn't in never falling down. It's in getting back up every time you fall and helping others do the same. The letter was signed simply, "With love and faith, grandfather." For a moment, none of us spoke. The evening air was filled with the sound of crickets beginning their nightly chorus, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour. "He believed in me more than I ever believed in myself," I finally said. "That's what good grandfathers do," Eleanor replied with a smile. Victoria stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the garden where the last rays of sunlight were painting the roses golden. "I want to make you an offer," she said without turning around. "What kind of offer?" "I want to help you. With the business side of things, the management, the practical stuff you'll need to learn." She turned back to face me. "I may have made my career about appearances, but I do know how to run a business. And maybe working on something meaningful would help me remember who I used to be before I got so focused on who I thought I should become." The offer surprised me, but it also felt right somehow. Victoria had always been the practical one, the planner, the one who could see 3 moves ahead. "What about James? What about your life in Atlanta?" Victoria's smile was sad but determined. "Maybe it's time I stopped living someone else's version of my life and started figuring out what my own version looks like." Eleanor clapped her hands together softly. "Now that sounds like a plan worth pursuing." 3 months later, I stood in the office that used to belong to my grandfather, looking out over the Montgomery cotton mill. The old brick buildings stretched along the riverbank, their windows gleaming in the morning sun. What had once been a struggling textile operation was slowly transforming into something entirely different. Victoria sat across from me, her laptop open, surrounded by architectural plans and financial projections. She'd moved back to Savannah 6 weeks ago, leaving behind her marriage and her Atlanta life. The divorce wasn't easy, but she seemed lighter somehow, more like the sister I remembered from childhood. "The contractor says the first phase of renovation will be complete by Christmas," she reported, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. She'd stopped coloring it and was letting the natural auburn color grow out. "The community center space, the art studios, and the small business incubators." I nodded, still amazed at how quickly things were moving. The Montgomery Mill Community Center was my grandfather's legacy reimagined for the 21st century. Instead of producing cotton textiles, we would be producing opportunity, creativity, and community connection. "And the after-school program?" I asked. "Fully funded for the next 5 years with space for 200 kids." Victoria's smile was genuine now, no longer the practiced expression she used to wear. "The city is providing transportation, and we've got commitments from 12 local businesses to provide internships and mentorship." The transformation hadn't been without its challenges. The first month had been overwhelming, learning to manage investments, understand legal documents, and coordinate with contractors and lawyers. There had been moments when I'd wanted to run back to Chicago and hide in my old problems. But Eleanor had been right about the support system. The family lawyer, William Morrison, had guided me through every decision with patience and wisdom. The investment advisor, Patricia's recommendation surprisingly, had taught me the basics of financial management with a focus on sustainable growth rather than quick profits. Most importantly, I'd learned that I didn't have to do everything alone. The door to the office opened, and Ben walked in carrying coffee and a box of donuts from the bakery downtown. He'd taken a leave of absence from his teaching job to help coordinate the educational programs. "Morning meeting fuel," he announced, setting everything down on the conference table we'd added to accommodate our growing team of volunteers and advisors. "Any word from the grant committee?" Victoria asked, accepting a cup of coffee gratefully. 3 more approvals came through yesterday," Ben replied with satisfaction. "The Arts Education Grant, the Small Business Development Fund, and the Community Garden Project." Total of $340,000 in additional funding. I shook my head in amazement. 6 months ago I'd been worried about $37. Now we were managing grants and donations that totaled in the hundreds of thousands. The learning curve had been steep, but gradually I was beginning to understand that money was just a tool. What mattered was how you used it. There's something else, Ben continued, his expression growing more serious. Robert called this morning. Victoria and I exchanged glances. Uncle Robert had been conspicuously absent from family gatherings since the will reading. He'd made some bitter comments about rewarding failure, and had largely cut himself off from the rest of us. What did he want? Victoria asked. He's losing the restaurant. Ben's voice was gentle. The lease is up for renewal and the landlord is doubling the rent. He can't afford it. Robert's restaurant had been his pride and joy for 15 years, a small but well-regarded place specializing in traditional Southern cuisine. It had never made much money, but it had been his passion project after his other business ventures failed. How much does he need? I asked quietly. Victoria looked at me with surprise. You're thinking of helping him? After everything he said? I thought about grandfather's letter, about building something that mattered and helping people who needed help. He's family. And more importantly, that restaurant employs 12 people who would lose their jobs. It would cost about $80,000 to buy the building instead of leasing it, Ben said. Plus another $20,000 for renovations and equipment updates. That's a significant investment, Victoria pointed out. And there's no guarantee Robert would be successful long-term. She was right, of course. From a purely business standpoint, it was a risky proposition. But I'd learned that not every decision had to be purely about business. What if we made it part of the community center project? I suggested. The restaurant could be the cafe space we were planning anyway, and Robert could manage it while we maintain ownership. He gets to keep doing what he loves, his employees keep their jobs, and we get a community gathering space. Ben's eyes lit up. That could actually work. We were budgeting $150,000 for the cafe space anyway. Victoria was quiet for a moment, running calculations in her head. It's not a terrible idea financially, she admitted. And it would give Robert a chance to rebuild his relationship with the family. Should I call him? Ben asked. No, I said, standing up. I'll go talk to him in person. An hour later I stood outside Robert's restaurant, gathering my courage. Through the window I could see him working in the kitchen, his movements efficient despite the stress lines around his eyes. The lunch crowd was thin, only 3 tables occupied in a space that could seat 50. The bell above the door chimed as I entered. Robert looked up from the grill, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness when he saw me. Well, he said, wiping his hands on his apron. This is unexpected. Uncle Robert. I nodded respectfully. Ben told me about the lease situation. I wanted to talk to you about it. His jaw tightened. If you're here to gloat, you can save yourself the trouble. I already know I'm losing everything. I'm not here to gloat. I took a seat at the counter, the same spot where he used to let me sit as a kid when Mom would bring me here for lunch. I'm here to make you an offer. Robert's laugh was bitter. An offer? What could you possibly offer me that I'd want? A partnership. I kept my voice steady, remembering how Victoria had coached me on difficult conversations. The community center needs a cafe space. You need a location. Maybe we can help each other. He stopped wiping the counter and looked at me directly for the first time. What kind of partnership? We buy the building, you manage the restaurant. You keep doing what you love, your employees keep their jobs, and the community gets a gathering space that serves amazing food. And what do you get out of it? His voice was suspicious. I get to help family. I get to keep a local business alive. I get to honor what grandfather would have wanted. I paused. And maybe I get my uncle back. Robert's expression softened slightly, but he wasn't ready to let go of his resentment entirely. Your grandfather left me nothing. After 30 years of trying to build something worthy of the family name, he gave everything to someone who couldn't even hold down a job. The words stung, but I understood the pain behind them. You're right. I couldn't hold down a job. I've failed at almost everything I've tried. But maybe that's exactly why grandfather thought I'd understand what you're going through. Robert leaned against the counter, suddenly looking much older than his 55 years. Do you know how many times I've failed? How many businesses I've started and watched collapse? 3, I said quietly. The construction company, the import business, and the food distribution venture. He looked surprised that I knew the details. Eleanor told me about them. She also told me that each one failed because you cared more about proving yourself than about serving your customers. That's a harsh assessment. Maybe. But she also said that this place, I gestured around the restaurant, is different. That you built this one out of love instead of ambition. Robert was quiet for a long moment, the only sounds coming from the kitchen where his cook was prepping vegetables for the evening service. I did build this out of love, he finally admitted. Love for food, for tradition, for creating something that brought people together. And I'm about to lose it anyway. You don't have to. I pulled out a folder Victoria had prepared with preliminary terms. This isn't charity, Uncle Robert. This is business. We need someone with experience to run the community center cafe, someone who understands both food service and customer relations. You need a stable location and financial backing. It's mutually beneficial. He opened the folder and scanned the documents. You're offering to buy the building and give me a 5-year management contract with profit sharing? With an option to buy in as a full partner after 2 years if everything goes well, I added. Victoria ran the numbers. It's a solid deal for both sides. Victoria helped with this? She's been helping with everything. She moved back to Savannah, left Atlanta entirely. I smiled. Turns out she's pretty good at business when it's business that actually matters. Robert closed the folder and looked around his restaurant again. I said some pretty harsh things about you. About your abilities, your character. You were in pain. People say things when they're in pain. That doesn't excuse it. No, but it explains it. And I understand pain. I stood up from the counter stool. Look, you don't have to decide right now. Think about it, talk to your staff, discuss it with Patricia. But the offer is real and it's open for as long as you need. I was almost to the door when Robert called my name. Why? He asked. Why would you help me after the way I've treated you? I turned back to face him. Because family isn't just about sharing good times. It's about showing up for each other when everything falls apart. And because grandfather believed that success should be shared, not hoarded. 2 weeks later, Robert called to accept the offer. The transition wasn't seamless. There were disagreements about menu changes, staffing decisions, and renovation plans. But gradually we found our rhythm. The restaurant became the heart of the community center. A place where kids from the after-school program could grab a snack, where small business owners met to collaborate, where neighbors gathered for everything from book clubs to town halls. By the time winter arrived, the Montgomery Mill Community Center was bustling with activity. The art studios hosted classes for both children and adults. The business incubators had helped launch 6 new local companies. The community garden had produced enough vegetables to supply both Robert's restaurant and the local food bank. On Christmas Eve, we held our first annual community celebration in the main hall of the converted mill. The space was decorated with lights and garlands, filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation. Children ran between tables while adults caught up on neighborhood news over plates of Robert's famous pecan pie. I stood near the entrance, greeting arrivals and marveling at how much had changed in such a short time. The mill that had once employed 24 people now served hundreds every week in various capacities. Penny, for your thoughts? Eleanor appeared beside me, elegant as always in her deep green dress. Just thinking about how different everything is from last summer, I replied. Sometimes I still can't believe it's real. Believe it, she said with satisfaction. You've built something beautiful here. We've built something beautiful, I corrected. I couldn't have done any of this alone. Through the crowd, I could see Victoria coordinating with the volunteer servers, her organizational skills ensuring everything ran smoothly. Ben was helping kids with an art project in one corner, while Robert emerged from the kitchen carrying another tray of his famous cornbread. Even Patricia had surprised everyone by volunteering to coordinate the community garden project, discovering a passion for sustainable agriculture that no one had expected. Your grandfather would be proud, Eleanor said softly. I hope so. There are still so many things I don't know, so many ways I could mess this up. That's what makes you perfect for this job. Eleanor's smile was warm. The moment you think you have all the answers is the moment you stop listening to the people you're supposed to be serving. As the evening wound down and families began heading home, Victoria and I found ourselves sitting in the office, feet up on the desk, sharing a bottle of wine and reflecting on the year. Do you ever miss your old life? I asked her. She considered the question seriously. I miss the financial security sometimes. I miss having a nice car and designer clothes and not having to worry about budgets. She paused. But I don't miss feeling empty. I don't miss pretending to be someone I wasn't. And James? Do you miss him? I miss the idea of him. I miss being married to someone successful and stable. Victoria's smile was rueful. But I never really knew him as a person and he never really knew me. How can you miss something that was never really there? We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the buildings settling around us and the distant noise of traffic on the main road. There's something I need to tell you, Victoria said eventually. What? I've been seeing someone. Her cheeks flushed slightly. Someone you know actually. I raised an eyebrow. Oh. William Morrison. She named the family lawyer who'd been helping us navigate the legal aspects of the inheritance and community center development. The lawyer? I couldn't hide my surprise. But he's nice, but he's not exactly rich or prestigious enough for the old Victoria? She finished with a laugh. You're right. He drives a 10-year-old Toyota and lives in a modest house near downtown. He reads philosophy books for fun and volunteers at the animal shelter on weekends. But he listens when I talk. He asks me questions about what I think, not just what I want to buy. He makes me laugh without trying to impress me. Victoria's expression grew soft. And when I'm with him, I remember what it feels like to be myself instead of performing a version of myself. I'm happy for you, Vicky. Really? Are you? Even though it means your business partner is dating your lawyer. I laughed. As long as you both keep doing good work, I think we'll be fine. Outside, snow had begun to fall, unusual for Savannah but magical in its rarity. The flakes drifted past the office windows, illuminating in the streetlights like tiny stars. Can I ask you something? Victoria said. Of course. Do you ever think about what would have happened if grandfather had divided the inheritance equally? If we'd all gotten smaller pieces instead of you getting the bulk of it? I'd wondered about that myself many times over the past few months. Honestly, I think it would have been a disaster. Robert would have used his portion to start another business that probably would have failed. Patricia would have invested hers conservatively and lived off the returns. You would have paid off your debts and maintained your lifestyle. And you? I probably would have paid off my student loans and used the rest as a safety net while I tried to figure out my life. Which means none of this, I gestured around the office and out toward the community center, would have happened. Victoria nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes I think grandfather knew us better than we knew ourselves. He definitely knew that real wealth isn't about how much you have, it's about what you do with what you have. As midnight approached and Christmas Day officially began, we finally locked up the office and headed home to Eleanor's house, where we'd both been staying while we figured out permanent living arrangements. The old Victorian felt more welcoming than ever, filled with the warmth of family relationships that had been rebuilt and strengthened. The next morning, I woke early and walked through the quiet house to the kitchen, where I found Eleanor already up, making coffee and watching the snow continue to fall through the window. "Merry Christmas, grandmother," I said, kissing her cheek. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." She handed me a cup of coffee and gestured toward the window. "Beautiful morning. It really is." We stood together in comfortable silence, watching the snow transform the familiar garden into something magical and new. "I have something for you," Eleanor said eventually, moving to retrieve a small wrapped package from the counter. Inside was a simple gold signet ring, the same one I'd seen in photographs of my grandfather. "He wanted you to have it," Eleanor explained as I slipped it onto my finger. "Not because of the inheritance, but because of the man you've become." The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for me all along. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," Eleanor replied, "for proving that sometimes the biggest gamble pays off in ways you never expected." Later that day, as our extended family gathered for Christmas dinner, I looked around the table at faces that had become dear to me in new ways over the past few months. Robert was animated as he described plans for expanding the restaurant's catering services. Patricia was excitedly discussing the spring planting schedule for the community garden. Ben was showing his boys architectural drawings of the new playground equipment being installed at the community center. And Victoria was laughing at something William had whispered in her ear, her face bright with genuine happiness. 6 months ago, we'd all been living separate lives, connected by blood but divided by resentment, misunderstanding, and unmet expectations. Now we were building something together, each contributing our unique strengths to a shared vision. It wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements, still moments of frustration, still challenges we hadn't anticipated. But it was real in a way that my old life had never been real. As Eleanor raised her glass for the traditional Christmas toast, I felt the weight of grandfather's ring on my finger and the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. But it was a good weight, a meaningful weight. "To family," Eleanor said, her voice carrying across the table. Not just the one we're born into, but the one we choose to build together. To family, we all echoed, and I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we'd face them together. The snow continued falling outside, blanketing Savannah in rare winter beauty. And inside the house that had sheltered 4 generations of Montgomerys, a new chapter was beginning, built on the foundation of an old man's faith in a grandson who'd finally learned to believe in himself. In the end, the inheritance hadn't just changed my bank account. It had changed my understanding of what wealth really meant, what family really was, and what I was really capable of when I stopped focusing on my failures and started focusing on how I could serve others. Sometimes the most valuable gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. And sometimes the person everyone thinks is the least likely to succeed is exactly the person who needs the chance to prove them wrong, not for their sake but for his own.